Incoraggiarvi a prendere il sedie per favore e noi possiamo cominciare questa sera sull'archeologia e l'architettura di India. It's my very great pleasure to begin the proceedings for this evening's event in our series Urban Landscapes Indian Case Studies. In a moment I'll pass to Pipachora to introduce our speaker, but I simply wanted to commence with one or two ringraziamenti. First of all, I would like very much to thank all of our partners who have assisted us in this programme, which has been running for over a year now, and has involved a number of events, exhibitions, presentations, book launches, and has been a really exciting chance for the British School at Rome to look at architecture that is perhaps a little unfamiliar to us and to some extent a little new in Rome. It's been a really great pleasure to have been able to do this, and we could not have done it without the support of our partners and sponsors. Sponsors including Alfred Hall, Mulligan Morris, Brian Guinness Charitable Trust, Koshimei Charitable Trust and John S. Cohen Foundation, and our partners more locally, the American Academy in Rome, the Architectural Association London, Domus and Maxi. And in those thanks I'd like to single out in particular our gratitude to the American Academy in Rome, which has been tremendously supportive of this event, to its director Christopher Chilenza and the director of the arts programme Carl Kirkway for not only their support but also their hospitality yesterday evening. Thank you very, very much indeed. I would also not wish the opportunity to pass without a very sincere vote of thanks to the curator of this programme, Marina Engel, who has from the moment of the first conception been unstinting in her determination, imagination and persistence in ensuring that this has operated at the highest possible level of quality and interest. The final thing I'd like to say is that I suspect that we'll have quite a few people who will come in a little while. Could I urge you not to leave spaces in the middle of the hall that people can't get to, and shuffle up a little to make sure that people can find seats. And may I respectfully request everyone to switch off their mobile phones. Posso chiedere che tutti spengano I cellulari per favore, perché è una cosa abbastanza brutto di avere questi suoni nella presentazione. So, with those thanks, and my final word would be to say how very pleased I am to see so many of you here. I am absolutely certain we will have a splendid lecture. The exhibition outside is already a fantastic opener to this evening, but I will at this stage pass to Pipachora, passo la parola a Pipachora che ha sostenuto tutti gli eventi di questo programma per introdurre il nostro allenatore. Pipo. Grazie.
I will be very quick. When I was a child, when I was a teenager, India for me was Ian Forster and Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, no? Because we thought that the Beatles were our introduction to India. When I was a little bit older, India for me was basically Salman Rushdie, no? And the Midnight Children. And now India for me is a surface defined mostly by what Rahul says in terms of urbanism and what Suketu Mehta taught us through a wonderful book called The Maximum City. So this is the first thing I think is important to emphasize, is how important it is for us to have keys and introduction to understand these complicated conditions. The second point is I want to thank you, Rahul, also because is taking us back to this issue of the city. We spent the whole 90s investigating this problem of informal urbanism. Then somebody came to us and said, stop, 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 you're forgetting architecture. And they thought that the city would fix themselves by themselves, no? But the problems are still there. And Raoul is reminding us that we have to take care, we have to learn from this situation, and we have to upgrade and update our architecture and urban tools to be able to do something good in this condition. And the third point is that Mumbai is quite a specific city, but it's one of those cities which are an open text, where you can learn conditions, problems, devices, reactions that can be useful also in other conditions. We were this morning just facing this problem with passing from very intense and dense urbanist problems to less dense but intense as well problems. And there is a lot of things we can exchange, learn, take to and take from Mumbai. So I really thank you for the exhibition that I saw before, which is incredibly clear, interesting, strong, and straight to the point. The fourth and last point I made is that Raoul is a person which is very much into urban design and reading of cities and analyzing it, but he's an architect. And we have always been trying to be clear on this point. We want to find a way architecture can react to the problems the city is posing to us. Raoul designs buildings, builds buildings, but still its approach to architecture has very much to do with what he learns, what he studies, what it creates in terms of concept by going through the problems of the city. So these four things for me are very, very important. Raoul is an architect, as I just said. He's a leader of an office called Raoul Mehta Associates, which is based in Mumbai. So Mumbai is the real venue of his work. But he's also the chair of the urban design department at the GSD in Harvard. So he lives in the two worlds, and he lives in the other two worlds, the doing and the teaching. You know? So it squeezed this relationship into the work he's done. Raoul built the building for the Hewlett-Packard. I think he restored, so it's also into restoration, which is a very Italian way of being an architect, from preservation to restoration to urban design to architecture. It's our old prerogative that you are embodying in this moment. I would also suggest to go through his books, like Mumbai Sitting Within, which is a whole story, I think, of Mumbai, and many others. I will be very quick now, because I know we have to leave in as possible time as we are. And also he's been exhibiting his work in a number of exhibitions. I think I will really thank you for being here today. I will thank all the machine that Marina orchestrates to bring it to Rome, and I will thank all of you for being here. I will do very short translations of what he says, because otherwise Marina will fire me, but I will be as synthetic as possible. Raoul Mehta, thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to the British School, Christopher, for initiating and hosting this. Also to the American Academy for your hospitality. I was very moved and touched by the evening we spent there. And a special thanks to Marina, who has, I think, been ambitious, but I think in a really positive way, to grapple with a problem like this, to represent the urban landscape, to take on the problem of trying to see how one might discern what the bottom-up kind of tells us in this whole debate about urbanism. And I think for some of you who have seen the other shows and been part of the other lectures, I just want to put on the table four aspects. You set up the four, no?
Yeah.
Feminists did say work with the four, which I think are important in retrospect, because I think some of you might have felt a schizophrenia in the entire programming in terms of the swings of issues. But that is what India is about, and that is the ground in the Indian condition that you would actually experience. So India really, I think what's characterizing India, and many other parts of the world, I think follow in these characteristics, is one, is we are undergoing a simultaneous transition, which is that we are transitioning out of socialism and into capitalism. These are not clean, you don't cross a threshold overnight and then you moved into another ideology. These are clumsy transitions which create schizophrenic environments. So that's one. The second is we're a mutinous democracy, I think, like Italy. And I think the mutinous democracy produces a very particular kind of landscape versus the autocracies. Why do we allude to Shanghai and Singapore? Those are autocracies. For Italy and for India, those don't become relevant. The third is, of course, the question in the simultaneous transition of the role of the state, and that's very complicated. And the third is the fourth is one that has huge implications when we look at the aesthetics of a place, which is that in a place like India, aesthetic modernity arrived in India before social modernity. It was Corbusier who came through the modernization process that Nehru initiated. You had a group of young architects at that moment in the 50s who became host to these ideas, and you had the state embracing aesthetics of modernity, but society had to modernize. And this disjuncture is a very critical one for those of you who experience India. And so I think if you use these four lenses and look back at what has happened here in the last year, it's quite incredible because it's a really ambitious project in terms of projection.
Allora, salto i ringraziamenti che sono stati fatti in tutti i modi. Raul intende proporre 4 temi che ci servono anche per ricondurre a coerenza tutto questo programma che è stato fatto dalla British School sull'India, che ha visto fotografi, architetti, antropologi, e che quindi sono 4 temi importanti che servono a capire l'India. Il primo è il fatto che l'India sta attraversando un periodo di transizione simultanea, no? dal socialismo al capitalismo, attraversa diverse condizioni, ha tutta una serie di transizioni che la società sta attraversando. La seconda era what democracy?
Mutinous democracy, meaning a crazy democracy.
Una democrazia molto simile alla nostra. No, ha detto che c'è molta similitudine tra il modo in cui la democrazia si applica in India e quella che vediamo.
We have an Italian running our democracy.
No. Il terzo elemento è la forma con cui lo Stato è presente nella vita delle persone e quindi il rapporto con lo Stato che stabilisce con il territorio e con le persone. E la quarta, molto importante, è che come in altri posti del mondo, ma anche in Italia, la modernità è arrivata prima come una categoria estetica e poi come una categoria sociale, cioè il rinnovamento delle forme architettoniche ha preceduto, diciamo, quello che era il rinnovamento sociale, che doveva essere invece la premessa per la modernità.
So my practice, which is in Mumbai, and that's why I call this sort of presentation Working in Mumbai, is really about negotiating a landscape where global flows don't erase and remake landscapes but are forced to occupy local fissures. And I think this creates fascinating hybrid conditions, startling adjacencies, and some practitioners refer to this as the informal city as this landscape evolves. And I think this is something that I react to in the construction of the idea of the kinetic city, because I think the binary of the formal and the informal is not a productive binary for designers, because your alliances then get forced to lie in one of those spaces. So you have architects who work in the informal city, work with slums and upgradation, and you have architects working in the formal city. But I believe that there's a third space, the kinetic city, which is something that resonates for me across the globe as an urban condition of flux that is emerging.
L'idea, il mio ufficio, il mio studio è a Bombay, e Bombay è un ottimo posto per vedere come si sovrappongono e come i flussi globali, quelli che condizionano tutto lo spazio abitato oggi, si sovrappongono e producono episodi, forme locali, no? Caratteri locali. Il mio lavoro sulla città cinetica è appunto questo, capire come non possiamo accettare passivamente, no, la divisione tra la città formale e quella informale, tra l'urbanismo formale e quello informale, tra gli architetti che lavorano sulla città, sull'Islam, cioè quelli che invece lavorano e fanno le case eleganti come i nostri amici di Studio Mumbai che abbiamo visto qualche volta fa. Quello che la città Kinetic City propone di essere è un terzo elemento in grado di costruire una connessione tra questi due mondi e diventare quindi uno strumento di conoscenza e di progetto.
So in this next section, I'm going to share with you observations from Mumbai that perhaps challenge this neat equation of the binary, where we might situate ourselves as designers, and more importantly, how we might be inspired by the design intelligence of the informal to act and intervene as designers and activists in our own localities. And I think there's some specific aspects of the city that have, I believe, borne substantially, at least on my way of thinking and my practice, which is what I'll share with you. Mumbai, as it is now referred to, like several cities, I mean, it's grown incredibly quickly. I mean, this expansion is mind-boggling. It's resulted in a particular kind of landscape where the rich and the poor, the formal and the informal city, as we talk about, actually exists in one space. And in this post-industrial scenario, it has resulted in a new system with a fragmentation of services and production locations, which is very critical, and has resulted in a bazaar-like urbanism, which has woven its presence through the entire landscape. And it's an urbanism created by those outside the elite domains of the formal modernity of the state. And Ravi Sundaram refers to it as a pirate modernity that slips under the law of the city to simply survive without any conscious attempt at constructing a counterculture. Now, this phenomenon is critical to the city being connected to the global economy. However, the spaces it creates has been largely excluded from the cultural discourse on globalization, which focuses on the elite domains of production in the city. So it's not only the city of the poor that I'm referring to, or the regular models of the formal and the informal and other such binaries. I mean, the work on Lagos, for example, by Rem Koolhaas is a case in point, which has, I think, made a very, very interesting reading and observation of the city, but it leaves us cold in terms of how we can speculate beyond that. And therefore, I think this construction of the notion of the kinetic space is where I believe these models collapse. And perhaps could be more productive. And it is to this space, the space of the kinetic city, that I believe we should focus our attention. And the question for us then is, can we design for these spaces as architects, conservationists, urban designers? Can we design with a divided mind?
L'idea è quella di sfidare questo tema binario, no? Quindi di metterlo in discussione e soprattutto capire come nella città informale c'è un'intelligenza dello spazio che ci può far capire ed aiutare a comprendere la potenzialità anche risolutiva che abbiamo dentro la città informale. Una cosa importante da dire è che la città informale non è semplicemente la città dei poveri contro la città formale che è la città dei ricchi. La città informale è il prodotto di riproduce una controcultura della città e ha un suo modo specifico di relazionarsi alla globalizzazione. C'è un modo ufficiale di costruire la città, c'è un modo, come dire, non ufficiale di costruire la città, e in questa frizione si scatenano una serie di consapevolezze, di forze, di sapienza intorno alla città che ha un suo rapporto specifico con la condizione globale. Quindi Raul vuole fare un passo in più rispetto a quello che ha fatto Koolhaas nella lettura di Lagos, dove ha registrato una condizione particolare dell'urbanismo informale, ma noi vogliamo lui vuole trarre argomenti, strumenti e tecniche per costruire un sapere più accurato intorno al progetto della città.
Okay. So now I'm going to run you through some examples. We might not need the translation till we go back to some of those ideas, but the kinetic city is not perceived therefore by its architecture or cohesive urban design gestures always, but by spaces which hold associative values and are supportive of lives, patterns of occupation, determine its form and perception. It's an indigenous urbanism that has no particular local logic. It's not necessarily the city of the poor as most images might suggest, but it is a temporal articulation and occupation of space which not only creates a richer sensibility of spatial occupation, but also suggests how spatial limits are expanded to include formerly unimagined uses in urban conditions. So for example, open space, when a city grows as quickly as this, open space, and that is into scale, the diagram in comparison to New York and Delhi. I mean, the dearth of open space in Mumbai is mind-boggling, and it's scattered, so it's not consolidated. This is to scale again. It's not consolidated, it's fragmented. And so the cricket fields, and this is, I was saying yesterday to Christopher, this is this beautiful Indian game that was invented by the British. Cricket is something that we hold sacred. And in Mumbai, cricket is played, and in the evenings it becomes a venue for very opulent weddings. And the cricket pitch, which is sacred, no one touches. and everything wraps around it. The club members take high tea, the samosas come from the kitchen also serves the wedding, and in the morning the wedding sort of disappears, and you have this temporal. So this is when the city becomes an elastic condition. Similarly, at festivals, that street becomes an auditorium with the creation of a gate for 10 days in paper mache, and this becomes a temporary articulation of that space. Or for other forms of festivals, I mean, the space becomes very elastic. This is a grade 1 building, which on the 15th of August, this is a British building, only classical building, it's a grade 1 building, but on Independence Day of India, on the 15th of August, it's the monsoon, so the Public Works Department, to have the governor go up there, rash the building up like this. So they, in a funny way, they subvert a colonial icon. The conservation architects in the city go crazy. They write letters to the editor. That's a very powerful form of protest in India. But of course, even by UNESCO's stipulations, this is okay because it's reversible. By the next morning, it all disappears. There are no nails used. They just use rope to tie it. So this flexibility, this elasticity, this temporal articulation of meaning, where meanings are also not stable, is one of the characteristics of the kinetic city. Or a mosque expands on Fridays to actually accommodate prayer. Now, when I was in Basel a month ago at the Christmas market, it actually wasn't any different, except that the Christmas market happens once a year. And so I think the possibility of temporal articulation of space and occupation and this elasticity somewhere at the time of the City Beautiful disappeared from our discussion about urbanism, where predictability and the static city, that is, architecture as the sole spectacle of the city, became center stage. And these sensibilities of this flux, of this temporary articulation, actually disappear. And so the argument here is, how can we go back to build a narrative where we can create this blur between these two spaces that we set up in a non-productive binary of the formal and the informal? The characteristics of these are essentially, if one distills it down to elasticity, incrementalism, and appropriation, healthy appropriation, mutual appropriation of space. And this is really, these are the three characteristics that I believe make this kind of city. This is a diagram that I call the 5 stages of squatting. And this is how a city like mine is made. People very slowly and incrementally become occupiers of space, and then the whole space is made by these incremental moves. Incrementalism is very critical. Procter & Gamble made the biggest breakthrough in marketing history by reinventing packaging. You know, so for example, a bottle of shampoo for a laborer who works on a construction site costs as much as their monthly salary, and they don't need that shampoo bottle that much. But if they have small sachets of shampoo which they can buy for a few cents and use when they need, it opens up the bottom of the pyramid, is what C.K. Prahlad, economist, management professor from the University of Michigan, described. And this opened up a market of millions in India for Procter & Gamble. And this is a form of incrementalism which now also contributes to the popular visual culture, because hawkers use these to divide their stalls and it glistens. But this is the kind of incrementalism that corporations understand when they intervene in markets, but planners, we don't know how to grapple with incrementalism any longer. Or McDonald's, in Mumbai, McDonald's does home delivery. There's nothing like a drive-in because no one can drive in anyway. So McDonald's is actually, they have completely inverted the fundamental principle on which they were founded, which is people getting off the freeway to drive in to get a burger. And they home deliver. And they have a massive market by just inverting that paradigm. And I think that's interesting. Of course, one can map this and fetishize it and find a logic, but I think there's more to it than that. Also, in the kinetic city, architecture is not any longer the spectacle of the city. There are many new things that have, phenomena that have emerged as the new spectacles of the city. And in Mumbai, for example, this wonderful festival of the Ganesh god, which is the elephant god, which is a festival that goes on the lunar calendar for 10 days, engages 5 million people in the city. And the city is transformed with, like these auditoriums that I showed you, at different levels of the community, this celebration that happens. And on the last day, the idols, millions of people immerse the idols in the water and it disappears. So here, immersion becomes the metaphor of the spectacle of the city. as the clay idol dissolves in the water of the bay, the spectacle comes to a close. There are no static or permanent mechanisms to encode the spectacle. Here, the memory of the city is an enacted moment or process, a temporal moment, as opposed to buildings that contain the public memory as static and permanent entities. The city and its architecture don't mean often the same things and cannot be contained in a single meaning. Within the kinetic city, meanings are not stable, spaces get consumed, reinterpreted, recycled. The kinetic city often recycles the static city to create new spectacles, and this is one moment when that happens. Versus architecture being the sole spectacle of the city, and I call these the landscapes of impatient capital. Dubai, Shanghai, these are territories that under autocracy are prepared to allow capital, global capital, which is very impatient, to come there and get realized very quickly. And architecture is responding to that in the most superficial way. And so architecture is being reduced to what form you can twist your high-rise building in. Because the vendors who supply curtain glazing now rule the roost, because if they can supply something in 3 months, it means capital can realize itself. And so impatient capital is actually bullying our cities into completely different shapes. And I'm posing the kinetic city, which is human-centric in its consideration, as the diametric opposite antithesis of this. And my argument is not that the kinetic city is the solution. My argument is that other narratives have to inform this narrow narrative of impatient capital that is completely molding our imagination of what cities and urban landscapes can be. Sorry.
No, only 2 seconds.
Yeah, sorry, I'm getting carried away.
Se no non ce la faremo, riassumiamo molto, però direi 3 cose mi sembravano importanti. Uno di ricercare, cioè la città dal tempo del City Beautiful ha perso la capacità di utilizzare la sua elasticità interna, no? Le cose che crescono e decrescono, che si costruiscono e si decostruiscono come soluzione dei suoi problemi di rapporto tra le persone e lo spazio. Noi dobbiamo cercare di recuperare questa elasticità. Il secondo punto che mi sembrava importante era questa questione che l'architettura non è più lo spettacolo principale di queste città. Questo è un problema che in Italia abbiamo imparato benissimo. Lui gli eventi, no? sono l'immagine della città, le cose che succedono, le persone, gli idoli delle persone. Il terzo punto, che ruolo ha avuto l'architettura? L'architettura ha avuto un ruolo passivo di produttore di immagini per quel capitalismo impaziente che Raoul ha rappresentato con quel collage di grattacieli sulla riva. Noi non possiamo risolvere tutto attraverso la città cinetica, ma possiamo cercare di capire gli elementi che possono rimettere in moto quell'elasticità.
Thank you. So when we come to economy, so in the kinetic city, entrepreneurship is an autonomous and oral process that demonstrates, I think, the ability to fold the formal and informal into a symbiotic relationship. And this is very important because I think for me it's all about how these synergies can be created between these two extremes of urbanism where these narratives are sort of being developed and find how one can actually blur this in a synergistic way. And one incredible example in Mumbai is what are the food tiffin delivery guys who are called the dabbawalas, who use the formal infrastructure of Mumbai because we have a linear train system, and they leverage this to make operational an informal service, which is to deliver these lunch boxes from your house to your place of work and back, all for €3 a month. And it's 4,000 people who are involved in it. They are an informal sector, but they use the formal infrastructure. And so this is a wonderful case where these two fold into each other. They have a complex way of coding it. They make an error of 1 in a million deliveries. They deliver 200,000 boxes a day in Mumbai. And they use the train system to create a system of feeders like you would have in logistics without any complicated software and make this whole thing work. So they pick it up at your house. Then a mother or a grandmother or a mother-in-law makes you a wonderful meal, and they have a relay. Then they come to the station, they get onto the train. From the train, they start distributing it in the downtown. They break it down into smaller units. He's in the elevator, sorting it out for whose desk it has to go to, and then you have your lunch, you have a lovely hot lunch, and the box goes back to your house. And so this idea that a formal infrastructure is used by an innovative formal economy is an interesting example of the kinetic city, because these networks create, I think, a synergy that depends on mutual integration without the obsession of formalized structures. And I think the obsession with formalized structures is, I think, limiting for the challenges we're going to face in our cities, forms of different kinds of urbanism.
No, yes, ha portato un esempio chiarissimo di che cosa lui vuole rappresentare, l'idea di questo, chi di voi ha letto Meta, no, se lo ricorda, l'idea di questo sistema distributivo che va a prendere a casa di ogni persona il pasto preparato dalla famiglia e lo porta sul posto di lavoro caldo a chi sta lavorando. Poi recupera le scatole, sono 200.000 scatolette di cibo pronto preparato a casa al giorno e recapitato utilizzando però le strutture della città formale. E Raul ha detto all'inizio una cosa molto importante come l'impresa, no? La piccola impresa individuale, perché ognuno di questi è un piccolo imprenditore, diventa questo elemento, in questo caso di connessione tra il sistema formale e quello informale. E l'uso delle strutture formali da un sistema informale diventa quasi un antidoto per quell'ossessione che abbiamo per la risposta formale ai problemi della città.
And of course, housing is a critical one, which is much more complex, because this temporality with housing becomes problematic in many ways, and this is a much more complex question. But what it does is it actually, and that's the kind of tapestry of a city like Mumbai, where you see this actual amazing blur in terms of location of housing types, but a synergy that exists between these two types. And I think, of course, people don't invest in the house itself, but in many other things, because they don't have the security of land titles, and they don't have the connection to infrastructure like water. And therefore, I think housing forces us to think about, this flux, which is disruptive, dislocative, it's cruel almost, but what it does is it makes evident to us what capital is doing to our cities, because this is also driving the poor out. You're having a new imagination of the city, which is about a detachment. And again, this is propelled by the impatience of capital. And I think what it's doing is, we went through these phases. In the 60s and 70s, we denied that there was another landscape that was occurring, or the poor were even present. In the 60s and 70s, depending on which country, there were processes of eradication. Then there was tolerance as we got politically more sensitive. Then there was improvement in terms of slum upgradation and all of that in the 90s. Now I think as a profession we have to move into anticipation, into speculation. And for the housing question, how infrastructure is mobilized in a speculative territorial dimension becomes very critical, because really the truth is that the best form of subsidy, or the best form of subsidy to housing, is through subsidizing mobility. And that is an indirect subsidy to housing, which is less complicated, but it allows you to open up a territorial imagination which otherwise you can't do. So for me, the problems of slums don't lie in slums. You can improve it as a holding capacity for 10 years for a generation of children, but the long-term speculative imagination is what we have to bring to bear. And this again is about bringing these two narratives of urbanism together. It's not one or the other, and housing reminds us more than anything else that the speculative dimension has to be reconsidered.
Mumbai non è una città di tipologie edilizie solidificate, ce ne sono moltissime. Mumbai non è una città di edilizia informale. Mumbai è Mumbai è la fusione dei tipi solidi e dei tipi flessibili, no? Della città formale e di quella informale, e vive solo del merging, no? Del mettersi insieme di queste due tipologie. Ora, quando si arriva alla residenza, questo tema diventa ancora più importante e più caldo, e Raul ha riassunto, no, le varie fasi, quando abbiamo lavorato sullo sradicamento, poi quando abbiamo rimosso la questione di chi abitava la città formale, poi li abbiamo accettati. Adesso l'architettura deve anticipare le questioni della città per arrivare in tempo a capirle. La cosa più importante che ha detto, secondo me, è che piuttosto che rispondere alle esigenze dell'housing attraverso l'housing, bisogna rispondergli attraverso la mobilità, cioè la città è rimessa insieme dalla mobilità e non dal fatto di disegnarla in modo formale.
And so Clifford Geertz, who was a social cultural anthropologist, he talked about agricultural involution, where he spoke about Indonesian rice farmers who would cultivate multi-cropping on their fields. and it created a very productive mechanism, but also one that was susceptible to malfunction because it was internally complex. And I think you can apply this idea for urbanism, because a place like Mumbai or many Indian cities are about urban involution, where they are becoming internally more complex, highly productive, but also susceptible to malfunctions. And cities that are in balance are the ones that can make evolutionary gestures as well as involutionary gestures, how they can orchestrate the larger territory using infrastructure, looking at the hinterland. And these are all my works in terms of explorations in the academy, and we are trying to bring to bear some of this. I'm not going to go into the detail, but I just want to put on the table the idea that the proposition here is how one can actually blur these boundaries, how one can look at territorial imaginations as well as how one can create internal complexity that is very productive. And therefore then the question is, how does one learn from the kinetic city? Because I think here inequity dissolves in a condition of high density. People make space elastic, like I've showed you. And the difference between the rich and the poor dissipates, so to speak, as the porosity between territories is heightened and exaggerated. Of course, these rules exist for the sort of interpenetration. The times when this can happen are predetermined. It's not like a free-for-all. But how do you design for this condition, or can you actually design for this condition? Complex relationships that intersect in new ways, spatially creating conditions where meanings are ever shifting. This is madness for an architect to even get involved in, because the way public space is used is so elastic and unimagined that what do you do? And I think pluralism, which is inevitable in a democracy, is, I think, a pointer, which is how do you make different adjacencies work together? How do you soften the thresholds between different economic groups in the city? How can you establish common denominators in terms of infrastructural imagination? Can we sanitize the city without modernizing it, or rather can we modernize it without sanitizing it? And more importantly, can borders be constructed and softened, and can borders be made to be dissipated easily? And then could this become the basis for coexistence? I mean, I think these are the kinds of questions that have at least preoccupied me. Or is it inevitable that cities get made in one image like China has demonstrated? Or can this pluralism really? So the kinetic city, just to end this section, is obviously cannot be seen as a design tool, rather a demand that conceptions of urbanism create and facilitate environments that are versatile, flexible, robust, ambiguous enough to allow the kinetic quality of the city to flourish.
Mi pare la cosa interessante era il concetto venuto all'inizio, che era preso da uno studio di un economista su delle coltivazioni di riso misto che fanno in Indonesia, che bisogna mischiare il concetto di evoluzione e quello di evoluzione, cioè dobbiamo mettere in crisi il concetto tradizionale di evoluzione urbanistica della città per cominciare a lavorarci invece al suo interno. L'altra cosa che Raul ha detto è che appunto non possiamo considerare la Kinetic City come uno strumento urbanistico diretto, ma come una forma di comprensione per imparare a, per esempio, capire che la città può essere migliorata senza essere modernizzata, senza avere bisogno di un processo normale di modernizzazione. Può essere uno strumento che ci aiuta a capire i modi per rompere i confini tra la città formale e quella informale, rompere i confini tra quelle sacche di spazio pubblico e di verde che abbiamo visto nelle piante e le parti compatte della città che non riescono a nutrirsi abbastanza di questo spazio pubblico. In sostanza è un modo che permette di rimettere in discussione il sapere del progetto della città e rimetterlo in circolo insieme a una serie di concetti che peraltro vediamo messi sul video e che ci permettono di aggiornare il nostro sapere nei confronti della città e trovare paradigmi nuovi.
So in this second part now of the lecture that I'm moving into, I'm just putting on the board here things that have inspired me as an architect to sort of operate here and what might have influenced our practice. I'm going to spend 5 or 7 minutes very quickly to just show you varied things that we're doing, and then I'm going to concentrate on 6 projects which I'll take 10 or 15 minutes on, which just show you some of the spectrum of these concerns. And so the model of the practice has really been to look at, these have been for me the fundamental questions in thinking about architecture. One is looking at research as a mode of advocacy. of very consciously talking about how we can soften thresholds between economic groups in the city, how we can make our architecture more inclusive, how we can think of building as part of a broader ecology, which is about society, about crafting tradition, and I will talk about this a little bit, about the local and the global and what that means and what might be there for the model of practice that comes out of it. And these are broad questions, and I leave it to your interpretation as I go through it. So for me, research has been a very fundamental part, and this has been part of my practice. These are all the books that I've done on many different aspects of the city architecture, on the city, on different buildings. And the research sort of takes on the form of historicity, but it also looks at emergent new conditions. And I'm going to just share a couple of research projects with you. This is my latest research project, and I spent the last 10 days before coming here at the Kumbh Mela, which is this incredible city that is set up every 12 years in India to accommodate 30 million people who come as pilgrims there. And I am with a group from the School of Religion, Engineering, Public Health with 40 students. We set up a camp there to study this, and we're doing a year-long project mapping it. And it's an incredible phenomenon which lasts for, it's for these million pilgrims, it lasts for 55 days. It's the ultimate kinetic city in terms of temporal articulation of space. It is basically based on a religious event that happens, which is in the Hindu imagination very important, where the Ganga and the Yamuna meet, and in the lunar calendar, nectar from the heavens fell there, so people bathe there. I also bathe there, I feel totally absolved of my sins. And it happens at the confluence of the Ganga and Yamuna, and every 12 years. And that is the grid from 12 years ago. And when it's settled, it's like that. It's 10 kilometers long as a city. And this is an image I took in July when the water was flooded. And this river opens up in October to accommodate the city, and then it takes over the ground again. And that is the same image that I took last week with the city that has now been established. 3 million people live there at any given time, 30 million people visit. And it's a complete landscape with hospitals, clinics, theaters. I mean, it's amazing in terms of its social and physical infrastructure. It's a city, it's a mega city by all means in terms of what it is. And then we're looking at refugee camps. They last for 20 years. The flux that I think we were talking about is how do we, I mean, that's the reason why the narrative of the kinetic city becomes important, because this flux we're going to deal with all the time. And I think whether it's emergency, environment related, or just natural fluxes of economy in cities, I think the learnings are deep. If you go to the landscape of India, there's 7 megacities. We all know them. We all talk about them. That's what we think is India. There are 28 other cities. Some of us will recognize Nasik, maybe Hyderabad, and things like that. But there are 393, almost 400 cities that are 100,000 people today. These are supposed to become 1 million people in the next 20 years. These cities are very much like the city I just showed you, which is the emergent city. It's all a temporal landscape. There is no articulation of form there. 400 million Indians in 20 years are going to live in places we don't even know about. And these, we don't even know what form these cities will take, what their purpose will be. And therefore, I think more than anything, I know globally, I believe that these ideas are important, but in the Indian context, they become critical in us to create holding strategies, even for short term, to accommodate this influx. Because I think the rural-urban blur will also occur, which means cities will densify and they will de-densify. And therefore, I think the temporal imagination can become a very critical tool in this whole process.
Adesso, prima di raccontare dei progetti, racconta 2 ricerche importanti che ha fatto. Sulla prima, penso che le immagini bastavano, in una città che si chiama Kumbh Mela, che viene costruita per un evento religioso molto importante che serve per farsi assolvere di tutti i peccati, che raccoglie 30 milioni di persone, 3 milioni per notte ci dormono, e viene costruita ogni 12 anni, in un territorio che, come avete visto, era completamente vuoto, e quindi è una mega city che nasce dal nulla. Col paradosso, no? Che lì ci sono 30 milioni di persone che arrivano e spariscono nel giro di 2 settimane, mentre nei refugee camps, per esempio, la gente a volte rimane 20 anni, quindi questa elasticità è infinita. Tutto questo non è solo una speculazione concettuale, ma messo a confronto con la mappa delle città indiane avete visto che c'è le 7 megacities che tutti conosciamo, poi ci sono le metropoli, cioè che per loro sono città medie, e ci sono poi 400 città che sono superiori ai 100 milioni di abitanti, che nel giro di un tot di anni diventeranno di 1 milione di abitanti. Quindi il problema non è solo quello di fare speculazione teorica intorno a questo, ma di trovare dei dispositivi che ci permettano di contenere in qualche modo gli effetti di questo fenomeno e trasformarli poi in un fenomeno urbano che riusciamo in qualche modo a comprendere e gestire.
And so, talking in architectural terms for a minute, this is the landscape in India in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, what I call the architectural spine of awareness. Chandigarh, Delhi, Ahmedabad, Mumbai, maybe going to Pondicherry. Now you have a whole different emphasis, which is the IT centers, Kolkata, Hyderabad, Chennai, Bangalore, etc. And there is a whole new emerging landscape, and you will see how these cities will explode, which means really here is a tradition of more modernism, the modern aesthetic, education sort of paradigm, etc. These are open-ended. This is going to be a whole new landscape which has no preconceived baggage that it's either carrying from the colonial paradigm or from the modernist paradigm. And so this is going to be the interesting landscape, I think, that's going to emerge. And just to situate our work is all over India. These are all our projects, but it's largely in this zone, which has been very, very exciting for me. And because of our research, we've been involved. I'm going to run you through 5 or 7 things very quickly. I don't think you need to translate. Then I'll get into the 6 projects where I want to talk about some issues. So we've been involved in historic districts and trying to create an art district here. We've intervened and done some new buildings in the contemporary, which is in this case a grade 1 building. So we've been involved in craft and in trying to find new ways materials and sensibilities can reflect. It's been very interesting for us to work. We've also looked at suburban condition, which is what most young architects do, and this is not one of my projects, but the villa is what happens. And I remember meeting the contractor of this house, and I said, who's the architect? And he said, no, I'm the architect, there's no other architect. So I said, you designed it? He said, no, the client gave me a picture of the White House in Washington, and I just made it. So I said, okay. And so, but what this does is it's an inversion of the paradigm of the traditional house, but it creates exclusion. It creates very hard thresholds. It excludes the villagers from the rich people from the city who go there. So we've been reacting to that. And this is a house we did in that same area, where the living room of the house, which is the main living space, is actually just a veranda. So when the young couple who owns the house go away on the weekend, the villagers occupy that space. So it becomes a synergistic space, which becomes a place, the caretaker of the house sits with his family, he has friends and they have tea, there's a little tap there, the rain is collected, so the well is always charged. So even if these work or don't work, these become different kinds of gestures of what I was calling about softening the threshold. And it's not like you compromise the architecture, I think it has all the articulation that you would put in, but then you add some gestures like this, which I think becomes a contribution, or this other house we did, where we started creating space where the villagers could really feel like they were entering the house in these thresholds, to sit and have tea with the owner of the house or people who worked in the farm without really penetrating the privacy of the house, which had the requirements of urban people like a lap pool, etc. But creating these spaces of accommodation becomes interesting. Or we were asked to do a house on a tea plantation where we really subverted the image of the house, and it's called the tea factory by the local people. And for me that's a success because they don't imagine it as a rich person's house. And what we insisted with the client is we won't touch the tea. So the tea is yet under production. We put the house in where very minimally touching the ground, and what we cut for the road, it was all tested on site, and it was articulated like you would articulate for an urban person a house in the rural landscape using the local crafts and all of that. And you know, the synergy yet exists when people who own the house sit in the veranda, people working there also can make eye contact with them. They are not excluded. And I think these are small gestures even within the realm that as we were starting our practice, we began to understand. I also was very interested in the shift from the idea of weathering to weatherproofing. This is a complete change in the sensibility of architecture, where we now are obsessed with weatherproofing. And I think this is a wonderful city to really enjoy the idea of weathering in a sense, and of course the conservation debates have complicated it. We're also interested in the weather, the threatening quality of the monsoon, what it does, how the landscape explodes, and the relationship with nature, how you collect water, how you let it touch the ground. I mean, these are all very much obsessive in part of our practice. Also, the life cycle of materials, of how what lasts for longer, what can be changed. I think from preservation, this synergy is important. I just wanted to put that on the table just to share with you some of our obsessions. Then I come to the question of 6 projects that I'm going to quickly show you very quickly. And these are basically the idea of the global and the local, because I think this is an interesting tension that is worth us visiting as architects. And I think what is happening in India, in many parts of the world, is there is the fetishizing of the local specificity. The evocation of the local specificity through this fetishizing is really a way of, it's I think an easy and simplistic way to criticize the homogeneizing effect of globalization. Now, I think this notion that globalization amounts to becoming homogeneous, I think it's a dead concept. It was a concept that there was a great anxiety about 20 years ago, 10 years ago, but I think we have to really revisit this, because it's a real red herring in our discussion. Because globalization, actually this differentiation has to be conceptualized in terms of local specificity in the networks that are established globally. And so if you accept that there are networks that are global, the idea of the local specificity changes completely. And the productive argument then becomes, how do we develop meta-narratives which can help us see this? So a meta-narrative, for example, would be the idea of these simultaneous transitions that I was talking about, because many countries, even in East Europe, are dealing with it. These become, I think, the meta-narratives that help us understand the specificities of the local. So, I mean, to me, we use craft a lot, for example, but I think it becomes